Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Bøtker. Chapter 10. Interaction. Interaction takes place between objects in either the spatial or the temporal dimension. The objects that interact are potential objects composed of an infinite number of indivisible, immaterial points. The potential object constitutes the object in itself as an infinite, undifferentiated collection of indivisible, immaterial points. These points exist as the property of the potential object. In the potential object, everything that can ever happen to the phenomenal object, or because of it, already exists as its property. The property that exists within the potential object enables the actualized object to be defined when it is represented through the actualization process. Before the actualization process, the property of a potential object is infinite and undifferentiated. The property of a potential object becomes subject to definition through the expression of property and the perception of property. It is through the actualization process that the property of a potential object becomes subject to definition as an actualized object. The actualization process consists of interaction between two objects. When two objects interact, they exchange property. The exchange of property takes place when one potential object expresses its property, while the other potential object perceives the expression. Interaction is always immaterial and exists twofold as either an expressive or perceptive act. Interaction does not concern the actualized object, but the actualization process as a constituting process for the actualized object. A potential object can only express what already exists as its property. A potential object can only perceive what already exists as its property. The two potential objects, which engages in the actualization process, are not yet differentiated as actualized objects and subject to definition. The interaction is therefore not an immediate exchange of property. The exchange of property is mediated through the actualization process, where it is differentiated as either expressive or perceptive representation of property. Expressive and perceptive interaction. Interaction is the exchange of property through expression and perception. When a potential object perceives the expression of property from another potential object, it recognizes its own property in the expression. As such, there is no immediate connection between expression and perception. An expression is a differentiated representation of property. A perception is a differentiated observation, wherein a perceiving object attempts to recognize the property of the expressing object in its own property. The interaction in which the property is exchanged is immaterial, and as such an object can only perceive its own property. Before the actualization process, property exists as undifferentiated immaterial points in the noumenal world. The differentiation of this property and objects exists only in the phenomenal world. Therefore, the interaction between expression and perception is always nominally aligned as a phenomenal representation of the noumenal pre-established harmony. Misalignment, as misrepresentation, is purely a phenomenal problem and exists only under certain conditions. These conditions are the following. When expressed property is perceived in the spatial dimension. When perceived property is expressed in the temporal dimension. Spatial interaction. Spatial interaction concerns the exchange of property and alignment between a single expression from an object and the perception of that expression from another object. Phenomenal space is a composite which consists of expressive representations. The property that materializes in phenomenal space is the noumenal property of the expressing object. Therefore, an expressive interaction in the spatial dimension is a particular analog phenomenal representation of the infinite noumenal property of the expressing object. Expressive interaction in the spatial dimension is immediate in the sense that it is an analog representation. The represented property allows for the object to be defined as an expressive interaction. A perceptive interaction in the spatial dimension is a particular phenomenal representation of the expressed property of an object through the perception from another object. Perceptive interaction in the spatial dimension is the representation of the expressing object mediated through the recognition of the perceiving object. Perceptive interaction in the spatial dimension defines the particular perception from the perceiving object of the expressing object. Temporal interaction. Temporal interaction concerns the relation that exists between the perceived spatial expression of property from an object and the sequential recognition of that property perceived through the property of that same object. Phenomenal time is a composite which consists of perceived representations. The property that materializes in phenomenal time is the noumenal property of the perceiving object. Therefore, a perceptive interaction in the temporal dimension is a particular analog phenomenal representation of the infinite noumenal property of the perceiving object. As all objects emerge as expressions in the spatial dimension, the temporal dimension consists of perceived property. It is the property of the perceiving object that enables the emergence of an actualized object in the temporal dimension as a recognized finite object. A perceptive interaction in the temporal dimension is a particular differentiated analog phenomenal representation of the infinite undifferentiated noumenal property of the perceiving object. The perceptive interaction in the temporal dimension defines the property of the perceiving object as an immediate finite phenomenal analog to the noumenal world. The noumenal property of both a perceiving and an expressing object is infinite and undifferentiated. Although there can be a misalignment between expressed and perceived property, the perceived property will always exist noumenally in the expressing object. As a result, an infinite temporal dimension presents all possible spatial representations of an object, and therefore presents the noumenal property of the expressing object. An expressive interaction in the temporal dimension is a particular differentiated analog representation of the property, which an object has recognized in the spatial expression of noumenal property. Expressive interaction in the temporal dimension is therefore a phenomenal representation of property mediated through the perception of the perceiving object. Expressive interaction in the temporal dimension defines the object mediated through the finite perception of an expression.